there, and welcome to the Parable Podcast. I'm Danielle Zapchenk. Well, today's episode marks 1 year of the Parable Podcast, and I can't even believe it.
Oh, happy anniversary, happy anniversary, happy anniversary, happy anniversary.
From someone who is very fearful of putting my voice into the world to being encouraged relentlessly by my husband, here we are. We finally made it to the 1 year point.
Oh, happy anniversary, happy anniversary, happy anniversary, happy, 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 happy anniversary. All right, knock it off.
You know, there's so many amazing podcasts out there, so thank you for making time for this one. You know, one of the biggest ways God has showed up for me in this experience of podcasting is not only being able to use my gifts, but getting to meet people I would have never crossed paths with, and just hearing from listeners what an episode has meant to them. A shout out to Priscilla, who just stopped me at an event the other week to tell me that she is a new listener. From the bottom of my heart, thank you. Thank you so much. My greatest desire is that by hearing other people's parable stories, it helps you better discover your own story and how God is with you every step of the way. I can't wait for you to meet a new friend of mine, Ruth Lorensson, who talks about a season in her life where God was redefining it all.
Of course, he'll use the seen places, and he does. And I've seen him do that. But the proportion of what is seen in our lives to what is unseen, like, what is that? And I felt like God really challenged me in that season of that 4 years of nothingness, which is, of course, everythingness, you know, because he was doing all work in me. I felt him say often the proportion is 20% unseen and 80% seen. You need a flip.
Here's my conversation with Ruth Lorensson. Well, Ruth Lorensson, thank you so much for being on the Parable Podcast today. We met last spring at a conference, and I think one of the ladies said it best about you. They're just like, you just exude such wisdom and you just respect you right away. And I just feel that from you. You're such a lovely individual, and I'm just so glad to be able to talk with you a little bit more today.
Oh, thank you, Danielle. That feels so great. And I feel the same about you too. So thank you so much for having me here.
So Ruth, I can tell from your accent you didn't grow up in Colorado. Okay.
No, I came from Texas. Actually, here, I'm asked about my accent multiple times. Americans love the British accent, but often I'm mistaken for Australian or New Zealand here. But yes, from the UK, been living here for 10 years. So kept my accent.
How did you end up in Colorado from the UK?
Oh, it's like a whole story in itself, a different parable. Really, because I married my husband, who's American, and we lived in England for a number of years before moving to America about 10 years ago. And we originally moved to Orange County, but then we ended up moving to Fort Collins, Colorado around 8 years ago.
What is one thing that you miss about the UK that maybe you can't get in the United States, or just maybe family or special memories you have about that place?
Oh, you know, I have my hit list when I go and visit. A good pub lunch. You don't do pubs here really well. We get the sports bars, but there's nothing like a pub lunch, especially in the wintertime. You know, you go there on a Sunday afternoon, usually after church, and there's a big roaring fire and you have a roast dinner. So I love that. And then obviously just friends and family. I think, you know, moving, that was one of the big things of leaving so many amazing people and rebuilding that type of community. So yeah, but lots and lots of things, of course, too.
So tell me a little bit about your family. What do you do day to day in Fort Collins?
My husband's Chris, and he's a UX designer. He works remotely, so often we're all in the same house every day, which is super nice, you know, because you can kind of have that crossover of life. And I have 2 children, Titus and Penny. Titus is 11 years old. He was born in England, and Penny is my now 9-year-old, and she was born in California. So we have a real mixture. Their accents are all completely all over the place. You know, the only thing that I know is that they call me mum instead of mom. And what I do day to day is I mean, this will be part of my story, but I've just actually transitioned off a staff team here. I've been a pastor for over 25 years in England and here in America. And so I've just stepped off into a really unknown space, actually, looking at some exciting ventures. So I'm just enjoying spending time with the kids, networking, and I will talk about this in a bit, but I do a podcast and I do lots of writing, speaking and preaching. Lots in the mix there in the Lorensson family.
Oh, that's awesome. Ruth, what was your first job that you ever had?
Oh my gosh. I haven't been asked that question for such a long time. Let me think about that for a second. I think it was a paper round and I went on my rollerblades. But do you do paper rounds here?
I mean, I think people still do it. I haven't seen a paper boy in a long time.
Summer recently, my children did a lemonade stand, which we don't do we don't really do that in England. So I never got the experience of a lemonade stand. And within an hour, they fleeced our neighborhood and they made $30 each. And I was like, I should never have done that paper round. I made so little money for so much effort, where they were selling lemonade and made $30 an hour. I mean, crazy.
So I know this is going to be part of your parable story, but where do you think your heart for ministry, for somebody who's been on staff for 25 years, it's a long time, where do you think that heart came from?
Yeah, that's such a good question. And I actually think it started really early on for me. I remember when I was around 13 years old, I was part of a church-going family. And at around 13, I remember dreaming about being a pastor. And the sad part of this story is that at that time, I was going to a church that didn't actually believe in women in ministry. And I told my youth pastor, I said, I really want to, I feel like I want to be a pastor. I mean, what a strange thing for a 13-year-old girl to say, but I knew there was something in me that just loved the local church and felt like if I could do anything with my entire life, it would be to serve God in this way. And yeah, my youth pastor at the time just told me, well, maybe you could be a missionary or maybe you could do some other thing other than be a pastor of a church. So of course, proved him wrong, didn't I? But yeah, it really started there. And then I think I have a real interesting journey. I would say I lost my faith as a teenager and for all sorts of reasons, but I ended up really recommitting my life back to Jesus around the age of 21. And again, and from a space of, my community at the time when I wasn't a Christian was pretty hectic. I was like part of the nightclub scene in the 1990s in England, raves and with people whose lives were a complete mess, and mine was too. And so when I became a Christian at the age of 21, I remember, and I think this is a real strong marker of my ministry and a pull still for me to really think, well, what about the people who never would go to church? How do we reach people who are in the, and I actually started at the age of 21, I started a ministry in the nightclub scene where we'd be like with people and we'd be bringing in DJs and all sorts of stuff. And then we did cafe church, and my whole kind of beginning of ministry really started with that focus of how do we reach people? Let's not wait around for people to come to a Sunday gathering. Let's leave the building and be in community with people and know that not only we can bring a light to them, but they actually often disciple us too. And there's no them thing. There's a being human and together exploring the impact of knowing a loving God. So that was really where it started.
And you're right. It's not about the building. Like, how can we go to the people that are not apt to go to a church service on Sunday, especially if they've never experienced that, or that's just not something, they grew up with? How did your journey go from, you didn't have a relationship with Jesus, you were in the club scene, but was there something that was tugging on your heart when you were in that moment to like transition yourself to be like, you know what? No, I need Jesus in my life?
I'm a pretty all or nothing type of person. I think I was just angry with God, honestly. I think I always knew he was real because I had a real relationship with him at a very young age. And so I think my years of not being Christian were really rebellion. I equated God and church together, which felt messy. And so I pursued this lifestyle of being as much anti-religious as I could be. And I'll leave the rest of your imagination. But in that space, it was so dark and so hopeless. And I remember my sister, she was in university at the time, and she was a Christian, and she was in this kind of church and had loads of Christian friends. And, they weren't pretty cool and not doing typical religious things and just they felt pretty normal to me. And in my mind, I just had all these, I would not have gone to church at this point, ever, if someone had asked me. But I remember she was getting married, and I remember going to her house regularly to kind of plan the wedding at that time. And I'd never went to church, but her friends were around, and we'd have barbecues and whatever. And I remember going back on the train to Cardiff because I was living in Cardiff at the time. And I remember the first time I encountered this group of people who knew God, but didn't say anything to me, but just were being like community together. I remember sitting on the train on the way back after one of these weekends and having this moment where I just felt like I could see hope again. Like for the first time in a really long time, it was like I could see light. It was a draw to me just to see the light in them. And I don't think they even knew that they had it, but I could see it. And so I think that set me on a journey again to think, okay, actually, I do believe in God. I know that there is more to this life. And actually, if there is hope, I want it. And so it began to build a desire in me, I think, and basically gave my life to Jesus again because of 2 prophetic dreams that I had where I met God. And so I was entirely alone. And God just revealed himself. And yeah, it was awesome.
Gosh, I think it's in those backyard barbecue moments where it's not like somebody's just trying to be like, let me tell you about Jesus. It is in those quiet, still moments where we can have that encounter with God. And you had it later on the train, but just having those moments that is a part of our story where we get to connect with people in a way that draw us closer to Jesus. And that's beautiful. So Ruth, why don't you share, what story you'd like to share with us today?
Yeah. I mean, when you asked me to share a parable, I'm like, oh my gosh, where do I begin here? But I was thinking about, how parables do teach us these incredible lessons about ourselves. And there's really, I think the biggest story for me was the moving from the UK to the US and my journey of ministry within that space. And it's a giant story. And there's actually giant lessons there for me within it. And we'll go into some details in just a sec. But the main lesson that God really taught me, and it's really, I feel like it's a lesson of my life. I don't know if you've ever experienced that there's these repeated kind of topics that God seems to bring up and just gives another layer and another layer and another layer. But in this space of huge transition, uprooting in terms of community and ministry from the UK to the US, the one thing that I felt like God really spoke to me about the spiritual significance of the unknown place. And it was huge. And actually, even right now in my space that I'm in, transitioning again, I feel like, I'm learning even more about this topic. But I'd love to share with you a little bit about that time for me and the challenges that it held and some of the lessons that God taught me in that space.
So what I'd love to know before you get into it, when you say the unknown place, does that just mean for you what is in the future, or just maybe the unknown things that are in our heart?
I think it means a lot of things, actually. I mean, obviously, there's the unknown of what's going to happen. And walking into, I think we spend a lot of our lives knowing, we're in a job, or we have a plan, or we've got our 5-year plan or our 10-year plan mapped out. And then there are these seasons, I think, of uprooting. And sometimes they can be, for a couple of weeks. And sometimes, like me, they were for a few years. But I think there's these seasons of uprooting where we have no idea where we're going and what is happening, God, and the rest of it. And then also, I think there is, what I mean by the unknown place is it's your unknown within it. And so one of the dynamics for me moving from the UK to the US was, I was heavy in ministry in the UK, really at some highlights, I would say, of my ministry career. I was on a lead team as a woman. Which I hate to kind of qualify, but you have to, because we shouldn't have to qualify it. But I was on the lead team, not just like a woman's pastor or youth, like the classic things that can happen. Yeah. But I was on the lead team using my gifts as strategy in the church there that I'd been working for a number of years. For the last 6 years, founded a charity, a non-profit called Love Bristol. So we built this like big non-profit, acquired lots of buildings, and we're doing lots of ministry and mission work in the city of Bristol. And after a lot of work, just finally taking off. And, I was preaching regularly, at least, every month at the church, and also wider than that in different churches and some national conferences. And so in terms of being known, this was like a nice sweet spot for me. Well, especially if you're doing anything that's in ministry that's seen, you get a lot of equity from that space, and more people know you than you know them sometimes. And that was limited. I wasn't really known, but I was known within a context in England and enjoying the space of flourishing in ministry. And then we made this decision to come to the US, and which I believe was a real Holy Spirit-led decision. And then we moved here, and then we had like this really 4 years of being unknown, and not only not knowing what was coming next, but not being known, not having a community that knows me, not being known even by a friend, not being known in ministry, or not knowing other partners in ministry, and then not having, coming from that, some level of platform there to pretty much nothing. I'm in my house with my 2 children, changing diapers. That was my ministry. That's kind of what I mean as well with being in that unknown place. And what I felt in that time, I felt like God say to me, actually, the unknown place is the hidden place. And there's reasons, I think, sometimes that God hides us. And in that space, there was a reforming of some things that needs to be reformed in me. And there was a forming of some new things and new desires and new appetites of the spiritual realities, things like God's economy. What does God's economy look like? Is it different to our own? And there was a forming of appetite for, the impact of what ministry really can look like. Does it need to have a platform, or does it mean that it's like meeting your neighbor and having a conversation with them? And so there's so much teaching for me that happened. It was an awful time. I hated it. But, of course, with these parables, we look back and we think, oh, that was amazing. Like God spoke to me and God taught me, and he did. But there was a bit of purging there. There was a bit of forming there. And there was like God teaching me some real gold, like treasure truths in that time, which I think have, helped set me up to be who I want to be in ministry now. And again, like I said, I feel like this constant learning about that space for me.
Ruth, for somebody who feels like they are not seen, they're kind of in that unknown spot, what encouragement would you give to them just to help them deepen their understanding of how known they are by God? Even when we feel unseen, we are still known.
I was on a prayer walk the other day, and I actually felt God speak to me. And I felt him say, there are some people right now who are feeling overlooked. And I want you to tell them, Ruth, that they're not overlooked. They're hidden. And I think it's really important for us to get. Being hidden by God is the opposite of being overlooked, because actually it means that his eyes are on you. Like you're so on his radar, and there's such a reason why he needs to hide you right now. And so like in some ways it's being more seen than normal. I think. I can't remember where that verse is, where, and especially for people in transition, but there's that verse, I think it's in Psalms where it talks about God watches over you're going out and you're coming in. And I always see that verse. It's like God's like special attention is on you. It's like he's zooming in on you. And so my encouragement for people who are feeling overlooked and it's like, oh my gosh, like, are there no opportunities? Like, there's no. And I remember feeling invisible. Now, when I feel invisible, and it happens still, I think, oh my gosh, is God hiding me? And it makes me feel super excited because there's something that happens in the hidden place that doesn't happen when we're seen. And I think that there's healing that can happen, protection can happen, but it's also not a passive place. It's actually power can happen. Spiritual victories can happen in the hidden place, in the unseen place that sometimes can only happen there. Because actually, if they're too big to happen in the seen place, if you know what I mean. So I would just encourage you, if you are in that space, I know, like on the face of things, it can feel like a bummer, right? But I think now I've come to learn, like, it's so uncomfortable. It's never comfortable, but it's usually a rich season.
Ruth, that's really good. What you talked about earlier is how we have these repeated seasons of our life where either we're hidden or we're going through transition, and it is repetitive. We see this over and over in the Bible, and we also see it in our own life. And so you said that you were at this great point of ministry back in the UK, then you had come to the United States, and here you are, you're searching for community, trying to understand and figure out what's next. And you've had this extensive career now in ministry in Colorado, but now you're kind of turning into another chapter. So you're kind of in this place yet again. You said you were kind of excited about that, but is it also just a little unnerving?
Absolutely, like so unnerving. Yeah, it's another transition for me. And I think as we've navigated the last few years in church ministry and with global pandemics and all sorts of stuff, I know it's a conversation that's been brought up in church ministries. It's been incredibly revealing over these last few years. So for me, probably about at least a year ago, I felt the Lord leading me out of this space. And I was like, and there was a caution in me of thinking, because the first time round, it was incredibly hard, like 4 years. And I was thinking, oh, Lord, don't let me do this for 4 years again, please. And, there were things that he taught me in that time, the first time. I think what he taught me in that time, just to bring a bit of clarity, was about what matters to him. And I remember during that time, my friends from England were going, what are you doing? Why don't you come back? It's fine. You can come back. You can have a job, whatever. And, I was literally on the face of things doing nothing. However, I thought, well, I'll go, and I ended up serving at a local homeless shelter and working there a little bit. And I remember setting up this, when I was helping in that space, I set up this internship program for people who were from really hard backgrounds, people who were on the poverty line, single mothers, all sorts. And anyway, my first intern came through, and it's this woman who was a single mum. And I remember the first day she came in, and this whole thing was just being made up as I was going along. I didn't really know what I was doing. But I took her out for lunch, and no one had ever taken her out for lunch. So I took her out for lunch, and I said, I see so much leadership in you. I think this program is going to be great for you. And she cried. And she said, no one's ever spoken that level of affirmation to me. And so I worked with her for about a year, and we just kind of chatted, and I felt like I was building up her just confidence. And, she was working there as an intern. Anyway, what happened is within a year, she ended up giving her life to Jesus. She got baptized, and she ended up getting a job at the homeless shelter that she had the internship in. And I remember that time, and I just felt this so strongly, Danielle. I just felt like God say, Ruth, if that was your only assignment for the whole of your life, that would have been worth your life to do. And I felt like that is God's economy. And I just thought, oh my gosh, I've got to relearn things here, because in my experience of ministry and, preaching and building big things, and it was like God had to show me the small, and which is so huge in his kingdom. He had to show me the value of those hidden, small, everyday things that we do that make massive waves in the kingdom of God. And he put that appetite in me, which was so helpful. So I wanted to just bring that in because it's so important. And I think it really has established something. And I don't always get it right at all. And I think that I have, like, from that time, I think that as a minister, does preach. And I think whenever you're on a platform of any kind, whether it's a small church or a conference or whatever, whether you're a worship leader or a preacher, there is this level of being seen that you have to kind of wrestle with a little bit. Or just being on, Instagram these days, doing a reel. Everyone's on a platform, right? But I just felt like from that time, God was saying, of course, he'll use the seen places. And he does. And I've seen him do that. But the proportion of what is seen in our lives to what is unseen, like, what is that? And I felt like God really challenged me in that season of that 4 years of nothingness, which is, of course, everythingness, because he was doing all work in me. I felt him say often the proportion is 20% unseen and 80% seen. You need a flip. And so I created for myself this like little spiritual health check. So I just asked myself things like, what proportion of my spiritual life is in the public and what is private? Is all my revelation from God out there on the internet or in my preaches? Or is there some revelation from God that I'm treasuring in my heart right now? What about my prayers for people? Are they all done with them there? Or am I praying for people without them knowing? Or am I studying the Bible to just get something to say so I can look good on Instagram? Or am I genuinely excited about growing in love with Jesus? And so I ask these questions because I can feel myself getting pulled. And we have an appetite, don't we? I think it's just part of the human condition. We have an appetite for the seen, for the known place. And I don't think that's entirely bad, and I think that God uses it, but I think what's completely underrated is the unseen space, the unknown place, the hidden place where God can do incredible things. And not only does this kind of kick back, when you have that challenge, it kicks back against, the celebrity culture that is so non-kingdom of God in my mind. And it just brings us to that humble place. But I think it gives us this beneficial way of living when actually the majority of what we're doing for God, we don't tell anyone. We don't promote.
Thank you for being honest with that, because I feel exactly the same way. I love people affirming me, whether that's like cleaning the kitchen table or being on a stage. But it's hard. That's that hard balance. And I recently did read another thing of like, here are the checks that I need to offer to myself. And when I look at the Bible and specifically the parables, I'm thinking about the leavened bread. It's yeast. It is so small. And sometimes I wonder, why wasn't Jesus just so big? Like, why didn't he do X, Y, or Z? Or like, I'm Jesus. But he did it. I mean, it was so humble. It was mild. It was meek, and it was less than. And that really does resonate with me over and over again, because how am I incorporating that into my own spiritual life? How am I incorporating that into my ministry and the day-to-day with my kids and my family? That's so important. But yeah, I guess one thing is, how did you know that God was leading you out? Because sometimes we love ministry. We love doing certain things in our life. Maybe it's a career choice or, relationships. And when you love it all, like, how do you decide and discern, I guess it's time to just pause or be done with this?
It's so important to process with people and listen to the voice of the Holy Spirit. I think those two things. And I think there's that discernment. I think for me, one thing that it was so helpful for me, my lead pastor, who's been incredibly supportive of this process. And, we're still part of the church, and I'm actually still preaching there. But he said, when something doesn't go away, when it's, because like we can all have reactions, right? We can all be like, okay, I'm done with it. Especially in COVID, it's like, how many times did I say that in a day? Like, let alone in a week or a year. But so we can have these knee-jerk reactions of, I want to leave, or either negatively or positively. So we can be like, oh, I can't stand what's happening here, I need to run away. Or I'm seeing something else that's attracting me. And so to really genuinely, I think, discern what God's doing, there's a level of thinking, well, like, what is going on in me here? Like, give me eyes to see like anything that's emotionally driving this, because I don't think that's helpful necessarily. I think I just knew I could feel this stirring. I could feel a stirring for what God, I believe, is going to be doing in, like, I think that is creating some new things right now in the church. And I could feel the pull in me to make myself available, to be part of maybe some new things that God's going to do. But I wanted to, I think, often so many people, especially in this season we've been through, I mean, we've seen so many people not just leave ministry positions or staff teams, but people leave the church like massively. And a lot of it has been these emotional knee-jerk decisions, and not everyone. But I think one of the biggest lessons for me in terms of transitioning is that God really wanted me to honor the relationships that I had. And so to honor relationships is that you process, you talk about it. You don't kind of necessarily go immediately within 24 hours. You actually kind of talk through. So because I might have some blind spots, or I might have some emotions that haven't been processed that I'm not even aware of. And that way, not only do you honor the people, but there's this lovely way in which when you work with people through these decisions and involve people like your spiritual parents, you kind of involve them, then it can feel hard at the time, but then when you leave, there's this blessing that comes with it. And so I think that's been what I've pursued. And so we have this lovely relationship. I'm in a different space. It is unknown. It's slightly exciting. It's slightly like, what am I doing again? Oh no. And yet also I really have felt, again, God say, Ruth, even a couple of weeks ago, I want to talk to you about the unknown space, because not only is it a place where, all those years he taught me about his value, his economy, the impact that what really matters to God. But I felt him really talk to me just even these in the last few months about the power. I think we're in a situation right now, Danielle, where we really need to see change happen, on so many fronts. There's so much injustice in and outside the church. And I think there's a longing in me, and I sense it in so many other people, for change. And for change, we need power. I have a superhero in me that wants to do it alone, like muscle up, make it work. Let's just create a few things. And I feel like, again, God is saying, oh no, stay in the unknown space, Ruth, because there's some things that will happen in secret that will carry the power that you really need to bring the change that I desire. So that's where I'm at right now.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's in the quiet that we need to listen, because you're right. When something happens in our world, which it's going to continue to happen, there is that emotional response of injustice. We're like, oh, I have to do something. But really, it's the time for us to listen and process how that affects us. How can we be a part of it? And maybe we don't always need to be speaking, and it's just listening and processing, like what you had mentioned. Thank you for that. Ruth, tell us a little bit about, you had recently launched a podcast. Can you tell us a little bit about what it is and what's your heart behind it?
So this has just been a really fun project for me. I've never done anything in the podcasting world. It's a new form of communication, and it's a slightly kind of off tangent area for me, more personally driven than has been a space of ministry for me. But it's a podcast called the Autonomic Healing Podcast, and I play the host. So I'm like you, Danielle. And basically I just interview this therapist that I know called Tom Pals. He's an incredible man. He's 65 years old. He was a church minister. He's been in the therapy world for over 30 years. And he has discovered a way of really activating the brain through somatic work to really bring normalization over trauma. And so he works with a lot of people who are in spaces of trauma, have really difficult stories, or just like are overwhelmed by stress. I mean, we're living in a really stressful world. So I went through a lot of therapy with Tom, myself, and from some of my own traumatic history. But just over those last few years with Tom, just really noticed the difference somatically, so my body was storing a lot of trauma. So it's a way in which which he calls it bringing homeostasis back to the body, a well-being. And what I've found is that, I've really healed. And so that's been going on for a couple of years with him. So I said to him, hey, Tom, you've got all this amazing stuff. And he doesn't just do it for the body, but he does it's autonomic healing activation for the body, mind and spirit. So he does spiritual formation as well. And it's just fascinating. So I said, let's do a podcast together. And never done it before, but we've been doing it. We're on season 1. We just today launched episode 13. So I feel like we're doing really well. Yeah, it's just wonderful to be able to help people. I think it's a passion for me to help people heal. And I love that God has given us therapy and those spaces and people like Tom who've got some insight into how the mind, body and spirit work. So
I think the awesome part of podcasting is being able to showcase Tom to a whole new group of people who has a gift. And you're right, there's so much trauma and hurt, and it's in those quiet places when you're processing, you're like, how do I do this by myself? And it doesn't mean we have to. And so that's really exciting just to see what comes out of that. And have you heard any feedback, anyone saying this has really helped me, or at least transition my thought process of oh wow, maybe this needs to become more a part of my life?
Yeah, I mean, there's stories upon stories of hundreds and hundreds of clients who've gone through it, who, from Vietnam War vets who, are suffering from PTSD, and the first session is between 3 and 6 hours, which really basically, you think you live your whole life and there's all these, not just, often people don't just have one traumatic experience. There's multiple traumatic experiences and then stress too added to that. And it's basically stored in our body. So it's like allowing our body to normalize. So, people are really healing from it. We get so many testimonies of real transformation physically, even physically. I mean, for me, one of the things that I would feel my trauma physically. So I'd have a lot of physical pain, which is completely gone from doing it. And then Tom teaches you how to do it yourself. So you can it's like a practice that you can do at home. So it's great.
So good. Ruth, is there a way people can connect with you and how they can get in touch with you if they wanted to talk to you a little bit more?
Yeah. Well, I'd love anyone. You're really welcome to follow me on Instagram, and where I'm really seen. And you can follow me at Ruth Lorensson. And then I do also have a website, ruthlorensson.com, and where I just put some of my writings and my latest preaches, and you can contact me. And I love connecting with people. If you reach out to me, I'll reach back out to you, so feel free, and love to see what comes of it.
Your latest blog post, or at least the one that you had, the wisdom of the small, it really connects to what we talked about today, and you kind of just dive deeper of all the small ways that God is a part of our life and using us. So Ruth, thank you so much. You're a joy to talk with.
Same with you, Danielle. So such a privilege to be on this podcast, and I've been listening to it from previous episodes. So I'm finally here, and thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. Don't you just want to go have dinner at an English pub with Ruth right now? I love how Ruth peeled back the layers of what a parable season can teach us and the spiritual significance of the unknown in our life. If Ruth's parable story impacted you and any of the wisdom that she shared touched your heart, all of her info will be linked in the show notes at daniellezapchenk.com if you would like to connect. For those of you that want to dive into a time of reflection, here are 2 takeaway questions. Number 1, are you in a hidden space? Like Ruth said, this is not comfortable, but it is a rich season because we can find healing, protection, power, and victory. So if you are in that place, write about what you are learning, or maybe it's a past experience and what you've learned from this previous situation. Number 2, what is the assignment God is calling you to right now? Thank you for listening to the Parable Podcast. I'd love it if you could subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts, whether on Apple, Spotify, or even on YouTube. And if you could celebrate with me by leaving a rating or review, that really helps others find out about the podcast. Thank you so much to my technical producer of a husband for editing this podcast.
No, comedy is a place where the mind goes to tickle itself.
That's going to do it for today. I appreciate you for spending time with me. Remember, your parable, it showcases the seen and unseen moments of God. We're going to see you back again next week on the Parable Podcast.